Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Happy World Radio Day 2024. The theme for this year's edition is Radio, a century in... Hello? So the theme is a century informing, entertaining, and educating. It's a very apt theme for us as South Africans because in December, we marked 100 years of radio in SA. So I'm just going to pass it over to Nadia to do the opening remarks.
Hello, welcome everyone. This is Nadia. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Broadcasters. We are so delighted that all of you could make it today for this webinar. Could you please put your mics off, colleagues? Thanks. Please keep your mics on mute. And keep it on mute throughout unless you're actually going to be participating. We'd really appreciate that. We really are delighted today to have two fantastic speakers. We can hear you.
Hello, Reggie.
I know it's Radio Day. I know we're excited and we seem to all want our mics on, but let's put them on mute, please. As I said, we're really excited today because we've got two fantastic speakers joining us, and Offensive will tell you more about them. But just to welcome Zoli, who's already on the call, and I know that Prof. Sisanda is on her way and she'll join us shortly. So for those of you who are not aware of the National Association of Broadcasters, we're the industry body for the regulated broadcasting sector. We represent the interests and needs of the industry, and we're a 31-year-old organization. Offense runs our communications and research stream of work, and we're so delighted that he was able to put the session together today for us. It's lovely to hear all the great initiatives across different radio platforms, not only in South Africa, but globally, as World Radio Day is a UNESCO day that was started about a decade ago. And of course, globally, we also recognize in 100 years of radio. And of course, I know that colleagues, you are very familiar with the Constitution of South Africa, which guarantees our freedom of expression and right to information, to impart such information, etc. But also to be mindful of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which also recognizes and gives clear support for those provisions in terms of freedom of expression and the use of all media. This year, as we look at 30 years of democracy, I think it's important to have this conversation around radio in that very context, because it's very, very hard for us to imagine that, you know, during apartheid, we didn't have opportunities to participate and engage and be involved and immersed in this broadcasting sector. And how wonderful that we can sit here in 2024 and talk about a diverse, robust, and engaging industry. So thank you so much for attending. Please participate. Please use the reaction emoji signs to show your support and engagement. We really do want to also see any comments you have in the chat line, but really just have a fantastic World Radio Day. Please make sure it goes viral. Keep tweeting, keep subtweeting. Again, as I said, it's an opportunity to celebrate this medium, to recognize how far it's come in 100 years and know that it has a very firm future into 100 years to come. Thank you so much, Offense, and I'll hand over to you. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Nadia, and welcome, everybody. Thanks once again for joining us in marking this special occasion. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Sisanda Nkoala and Mr. Zoli Mapipa. They will lead the discussion on the significance of this year's World Radio Day. And as we mentioned earlier, the theme is a century informing, entertaining, and educating. So Dr. Nkoala is an associate professor at UWC in the linguistics department. She's the co-editor of a 2-volume book series on 100 years of radio in SA. And many of you will know Mr. Zoli Mapipa. He's a former GM for SABC Public Service Radio. He's an accomplished media manager who holds honors degrees in drama and media studies with extensive experience as a station manager. So what I'll do now is share Zoli's slide, and then he will just share some thoughts with us. Just 1 second.
Sorry, guys, I'll put in the earphones shortly.
Thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you so much, Offense. And a very good morning to you all, colleagues. It was, I must just say that it was a very exciting opportunity for me in writing a chapter in the 100 years of radio in South Africa. And if you want to have a squeeze at the chapter, you'll find it's chapter 4, and I delve, in particularly in the transition between for the SABC, between being a state broadcaster and assuming the role of being a public service broadcaster. My topic for now is basically just on radio generally today. Can I have the next slide, please? The role of radio, I think one of the key things that we need to remember is that as much as there's about 350 radio stations that are operational in South Africa, it came as the work of trying to achieve democracy. So it is a marketplace of ideas. We're trying to facilitate ideas in a market economy. And that's something that I deal with, for instance, in the chapter, to say all of these radio stations exist in a market economy. And my plea to all radio stations is to participate in entrenching democracy and making it a point that people go and vote, for instance, in South Africa, and entrench democracy. Because for selfish reasons, we are this 350 plus industry of radio stations giving us jobs or giving people jobs because it is entrenched in democracy. Otherwise, if it was a unitary state, we wouldn't be having so many radio stations and exposed to such different talent, languages, across the spectrum of the country. And radio has always been to create information affluence, through information, through informing, educating, and entertaining content. And the critical thing is the language. And I think Prof. Dr. Sisanda will talk about this, because we do need to make it a point that we develop the indigenous languages in South Africa. I mean, we've got about 11 official languages, including, of course, the sign language, which unfortunately cannot happen on radio. But the other 11 official languages are there for us to speak in people's language. And what I would like to appeal, for instance, is in promoting democracy, is to ensure that there is voter education in each and every radio station. What I liked, I listened to one station. They said, if a person has not registered to vote, and when a person has not voted, they have no right to complain, because they were given an opportunity by the Constitution, which Nadia spoke about, by the Constitution, to make sure that you express your feelings. And voter education is still necessary. It is as necessary today as it was in 1994 when we started voting, because people forget, and there are new voters as well. Younger people who will be voting for the first time. And needless to say that we are spoiled for choice in terms of radio. I mean, we can explore the different genres that we have, from drama, current affairs, interviews, talkback shows, promotions, even competitions. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of credibility, we need, as radio, to keep this credibility that we have. This legacy that has been built over years. Yes, radio started about 100 years ago, and democracy started about 30 years ago, but radio has always been a trustworthy medium. And we need to appreciate the legacy that has been left behind, because people believe in us. I heard it on radio, it is true. And the reverse is true. It is true, because I heard it on radio. And I'd just like to remind colleagues, you know, that it's engaging the formal institutions like the IEC, like adhering to the BCCSA prescripts, so that we remain that credible source of information. And in doing that is making sure that we have credible guests collaborating the information, collaborating, you know, the sources, so that the population as a whole does not get misled by people who just go and post something that they have not even tested, that has not been tested. People should be able to go back and say, I will listen to radio because I want to make sure that what has been said is true. And next slide. Radio is under very stiff competition, but like it was said a long time ago when television started, you know, that video killed the radio star, or television killed the radio star. It hasn't happened. Like video killed the radio star, it hasn't happened. Simply because we're able to juggle, where the radio is very, very flexible. It can live with other media. And for us and with our stakeholders is that radio is free, and the distribution, it reaches all corners of the world. And the professor will indicate the penetration that radio has in South Africa. It is still the biggest medium in South Africa. And the technology is quite cost effective. I mean, it doesn't even take 2 months to finish paying off your radio set, and it's free thereafter. And for advertisers will still need those numbers. Yes, they can go to those media that speak directly to very small audiences and all of that, but they will still need the huge numbers that radio has. And lastly on this one is that we're ubiquitous. I mean, right now, you can listen, our audiences can listen to us on cell phones, you can listen to us on television sets, you name it. We are ubiquitous. We live side by side with these new technologies. Lastly, in terms of appealing to marketers, I would like to propose or to put forward that we continue inculcating information affluence. And information affluence does not necessarily mean ideas. To me, it doesn't only end with ideas. It also goes beyond the fact that we are a market economy, and therefore advertisers with their products, with their brands, with their services, they need to come to us in order to go to the audiences. And one of the things that I've noticed is that, in fact, I've noticed it for a very long time, that our presenters, our on-air presenters, there is in fact even producers, there is this issue of being engrossed in the production of the content that you as a radio station come up with. We forget that we also receive content from advertisers, and that content needs to be sold. Our presenters need to be marketers, not just present, you know, in terms of they're doing a fantastic job in selling music, in selling what's coming up, in terms of selling what's this episode that's coming for drama, what's the talk show that's coming. But we also need to make sure that advertising, we don't put it in a small corner and it's just a nuisance within a radio station. It is part and parcel of the radio station because it informs people in terms of products, in terms of brands, in terms of services that are out there, so that people make informed decisions in terms of purchasing, just as much as we want to make people make informed decisions in terms of voting. So I feel that we have to come 360 degrees as radio, and also exploit the fact that we are now multi-platform. Radio stations are not just a singular platform now. So if we assist a client on air, we should be able to assist them in terms of digital platforms as well. And lastly, my parting shot is, this is our 100th year, and we can only do it once. We as radio need to make a lot of noise, because we are the first electronic medium, and we are still surviving. Thank you.
Like, there isn't a big difference.
Thank you, Zoli. That was an excellent presentation. Just remember, everybody, you can leave comments and questions in the chat box, and then we'll take all of them right at the end. What I'm going to do now is just play a short video by Dr. Sisanda Nkoala, just to kick off her presentation. Just a note that you might find that on some devices, the volume is low, especially your mobile phone. So you might need to change the audio settings from device to speaker or vice versa. So I'm going to play that just now before we kick off Dr. Nkoala's presentation.
With 94% of South Africans 15 years and older confirming that they own a radio set in one form or other, the place of radio as the country's most beloved and popular medium is firmly in place. This year marks 100 years since it was introduced in South Africa through the first experimental broadcast at the railway headquarters in Johannesburg on the 18th of December 1923. Over the decades, radio has literally become a friend of the people, with millions tuning into the 40 commercial and public broadcast stations and over 250 community stations on a daily basis. And yet, even though radio continues to be the most dominant medium on this World Radio Day, which is particularly significant in the South African context, in light of the 100 years of audio broadcasting here, it is worthwhile looking ahead at digital audio platforms such as online radio and podcasts to forecast what the next century of audio broadcasting might and should sound like. An increase in access to digital tools such as smartphones, coupled with the wider and better internet penetration over the years, has enabled more South Africans to turn to media formats such as online radio in their numbers. The 2022 Infinite Dial study found that the monthly online listening grew to 61% of the surveyed 15 years and older population, compared to the 39% in the 2019 study. Apart from the streaming and internet radios, there is also a growing trend of podcasting, which has arguably cemented audio broadcasting in its various forms as a key player in the future of mass media in this context. The place of online radio and podcasts in South Africa must be understood from the rich 100 years of radio in this context, where oral media has been a central platform for the development of linguistic and cultural identities. When radio first arrived in South Africa, it was not meant to include broadcasts in indigenous languages. It was only as part of efforts to gain the support of the black majority during the Second World War that black people were even thought of as a possible audience by the apartheid regime. But once the medium was opened up to indigenous language speakers, both as an audience and as content creators, through the first Zulu broadcast aired in 1941 in Durban, they found a way to use the affordances it presented to express their voice in a society that would have otherwise silenced them. And so, although other forms like television have, over the years, threatened to kill the proverbial radio star, the intimacy, immediacy, and sociability that audio broadcasting facilitates remains unmatched.
I think that video captures nicely the history of radio over the last century. And if you had any issues hearing it, you can just let me know. I'll share the link to the video with you. So now I'm just going to move on to Dr. Sisanda Nkoala. She'll elaborate more on that video we saw, as well as the work she's been doing over the last year, writing about the last century of radio.
Thank you very much, Ofenze. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, students. Good morning, radio lovers. Happy World Radio Day. I'm really privileged to be spending the day in the company of people esteemed as yourselves. Thank you very much to the NAB for extending the invitation. And, give a big round of applause to my colleague Zoli for his brilliant presentation that really looked at one medium in 2024. My presentation is titled Looking Back to See Ahead, and it is a reflection on 100 years of radio in South Africa based on an edited volume series that I worked on with various practitioners and media researchers. It came out last year at the end of the year to mark the 100th year of radio in South Africa, which the 18th of December 2023, and we are still in that 100 years, so let the celebrations continue. I'm going to switch off my camera just to preserve it, but how I've structured my presentation is to just talk through a timeline of radio within the South African context, because when we look at how radio has developed, and I am mindful that the text may be a bit small, so I'll ask that the content perhaps be shared with the attendees at some stage. But when we look at the history of radio, we can make sense of some of the developments that we see currently. So as far back as the 1920s, there were regular amateurs who were tinkering around with this very powerful medium, using it to play music in Johannesburg. And this, I think, is very significant because radio has got that ground roots appeal. Unlike other media like television and the internet and even print, where there was quite a central control from the onset, radio started with people who were just passionate about the medium, playing around with it. And we see that continuing even in how podcasting today is developing in our context, where it is amateur podcasters coming together to play around with this particular audio platform and seeing how they can use it as a voice in our context. So I think that is quite significant. And then, of course, the historians and media scholars recognize the 18th of December 1923, that historic day where there was an experimental broadcast by the Western Electric Company in Johannesburg as the birth of radio in South Africa. But we should not lose sight of the fact that even before this so-called official day, people were playing around with the medium. On the 29th of December, just a few weeks later, the first station in South Africa was put up by the South African Railways in Johannesburg. And then within a year, we saw stations being set up in Cape Town on the 5th of September, 1924. And then on the 10th of December in Durban, a station was set up. In 1927, an organization came together which tried to form sort of the beginnings of the SABC today, the African Broadcasting Corporation. And in 1934, we had a visit from John Reith, who was the founder of the BBC, on the invitation of the government, to come and look at our radio landscape and see how it could be modeled on what the BBC was doing. And this is significant because we see even today in our approach to public service broadcasting remnants of that BBC model. And then in 1936, the Broadcasting was incorporated into the state as the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, which is what it is today. So this first bit is what I call the foundational years that really just laid the foundation of radio. The second period, from 1936 to 1986, is when I think diversity began. And it began, we see first when the SABC was formed, we started off with just an English service. And then in 1937, the Afrikaans service came on. And in that time, Black audiences, indigenous language speakers were completely left out because they were not a priority. But there was the outbreak of the World War, the Second World War, and there was a recognition of the power of radio to be used to speak to indigenous language speakers and try and co-opt them into the perspective of the government on the war. So radio was recognized as a powerful medium, and on the 23rd of December 1941, that first Zulu broadcast in Durban happened. And that, I think, paved the way for radio as we know it today, because even though indigenous languages were brought in to serve an agenda, we see with the creative use of language, both from the part of the content creators, but also the audiences, how people managed to subvert to some degree or other the powers that be and use the airwaves to make sure their voices were heard. Also, another form of diversity that we see in this period is on the 1st of May 1950, where the first commercial service station was launched, Springbok Radio. Up until then, other than the amateurs, government had really controlled the, and it was really about the state's messaging, and Springbok Radio marked the beginning of a commercial aspect within our radio sphere. SABC in 1960, pardon me, in 1952, there was a rediffusion service which introduced broadcasts in other indigenous languages in Xhosa and in Zulu and Southern Sotho. And then in 1960, Radio Bantu was launched, which was specifically for indigenous language speakers. And then 1986, as the first English language station for Black audiences. So we see here introductions and the services being set up, moving away from the state in the sense that they were not part of the initial vision. And when that happened, the audiences and content creators of those particular services using them to ensure their voices are heard. Then we move on to the next period, which I call the birth of democracy, birth of community. And this is really the beginnings of the vibrant community sector that we have today. We saw in 1993 the historic transformation of the SABC from a state broadcaster into a public broadcaster. At the same time, Bush Radio and some of the radio activists were mobilizing, recognizing the power of the airwaves. They started off with a workshop called the Common Vision Workshop, where they formulated the key features of the community sector that we see today. There was the formation of the IBA through the passing of the IBA Act, paving the way for the official setup of a three-tier broadcasting system in South Africa on September 1993. And then shortly after, the launch of the National Community Radio Forum happened in December 1993. Now, even though Bush Radio really was the foundation and is called the mother of community radio, it was not the first official radio station in the community sector to be launched, because they tried several times to get licensed and to be established formally. But their efforts were met with resistance because there was a recognition that as a community radio station that was really activist in orientation, they had quite a lot of potential to disrupt things. So the first community station that was launched was Radio Maritzburg, and then Bush Radio was launched or granted a license, pardon me, on Women's Day in 1995. Another significant part of what happened in this period was the SABC rebranding its indigenous language stations in 1995. In how indigenous language stations were set up, it was really about propagating the apartheid regime and philosophy of separate languages. So the Xhosa was called Radio Xhosa, Radio Zulu, to really enforce the fact that indigenous language speakers were supposedly these separate people. But in rebranding, the SABC said, no, we are a rainbow nation, and just because Xhosa is your first language doesn't mean you are not welcome to listen to Ukhozi FM. So they rebranded, and that really, I think, transformed the radio landscape in that sense. And then the last period, which is one that we are currently in, is this digital period. And here we are seeing the development of radio happen concurrently with the development of the internet in our context. And with that comes some complications, because we are mindful of the digital divide in a place like South Africa, where you have areas with great connectivity and areas where there's no connectivity at all. So although this period has also marked a significant milestone, it has exposed some shortcomings of technologies that differ from radio, because radio, whether you are in a rural area, as Zoli was saying, or in a suburb, you are able to access it, and digital technologies don't have that capacity. But we cannot run away from the influence of digital technology on radio. So in 1999, there was the launch of Napster, an international company, which was the first streaming service. And then the interesting thing with tracking the history of digital radio is how, just like in the 1920s, where amateurs were tinkering around, with the internet as well, people have been playing around with audio for many years. And so when we say this person to do that, it's only based on the records that they have put out there, rather than what could be definitively established. So we have someone like Seth Rothman, who, for example, launched Two Oceans Vibe, and he described it as the first commercial blog platform and the first online radio station in the country in 2002. Now, whether that's the case or not, we can't say definitively, because people could have been playing around with online radio way before him, but he launched Two Oceans Vibe and positioned it as such. We also see in 2006, the Prime Media Station 94.7 launching its first podcast product. And in doing this, it asserted itself as the first radio station in the country to offer mobile downloads of its content. And now this has become the way a lot of people listen to radio. We are not tuned in at the moment to what's happening on traditional radio, but we will most likely go at the end of this particular session and download a podcast of what was happening on SAFM or the celebrations on 702, because that is how people consume radio because of the digital affordances of this era. We then in June 2012, Apple released a standalone Apple podcast. And another significant local moment was on the 1st of May 2014 with the launch of Cliff Central. Now this I deem significant because Gareth Cliff was a former radio practitioner, and he left the airwaves to do what he said was establish unradio, a form of radio that goes against and rules of traditional radio. So his platform, Cliff Central, was seeking to challenge some of the established ways of doing radio, such as having a BCCSA that regulates content. And that is a significant milestone where someone is trying to take the airwaves into their own hands using digital platforms. And then lastly, the launch of Thibaut Touch's platform, which was called Touch Central. Now, this was significant because in how he positioned himself and this platform initially, it was supposed to be a movement to make the airwaves more, the airwaves online more accessible through the Data Must Fall campaign that colleagues would remember. And obviously this turned out to be a gimmick in the end, but we see again, just looking at how with community media, people see the platform and the audio capabilities as a way of mobilizing against or towards ends that they esteem. And we see that also happening in digital platforms through an entity like Touch Central, although, like I say, that was a gimmick. So that overview of radio really it was something that was quite important that we featured in our 100 Years of Radio book series. And we can move on to the next slide, Offensive. And we compiled the volume because we really saw it as an important moment of reflection. 100 years, it's a big milestone for radio. And it reminds us of what is possible. Radio started off as this amateur medium, and now it's literally the most dominant medium in Africa for decades. Media come, media go, but radio endures and often incorporates those media. So it reminds us that it is possible to find ways, even in contexts like South Africa, where indigenous languages and indigenous language speakers were excluded, to take a medium and transform it so that it can land up in the hands of the people. We're also reminded of what it's taken to get here. Not primarily in the South African context, but we see it in a context like Rwanda, where radio was used really as a means of propagating genocide. And it's not something to be taken lightly. And then lastly, linked to that, we are reminded of the dangers. And with the advent of digital technology, we see a lot of people using online spaces and audio, and even that translating into on air through some conversations that you're thinking should not happen. We remember a conversation that happened about the earth being flat and how troubling those kind of discourses are on such a powerful. So this century milestone gives us an opportunity to reflect. Next slide, please. The books themselves were also an important moment of collaboration. These kind of anniversaries, even today, we see Zoli and I sharing a platform, a practitioner and an academic coming together and speaking to a very diverse audience in a way that we don't normally do. So we celebrate these milestones because they allow us as radio practitioners and radio scholars to reflect together. We as academics bring our theoretical strengths, while industry brings the practice aspect. And together, as we think about where radio should go in the next century, we can come up with more meaningful propositions rather than working in silos. Next slide. And specifically with the contents within the book, what we have done is not tried to give a historic overview of radio. That would be impossible. But we've taken modern day case studies within the current radio landscape, whether it's looking at specific radio stations or looking at specific presenters, looking at specific phenomenon around radio, such as translanguaging. And we've sought to understand those through the lens of the historic development. So how has what has happened over the last 100 years shaped what it is that we listen to today? We've also tried to foreground the lived experiences of radio practitioners to tell a relevant radio story. There are people with rich knowledge about radio who, because perhaps are not academics, have been kept out of developing the scholarly rigor around radio. So we've tried to foreground their experiences in these volumes. Zoli's chapter, for example, really sets the scene for the first volume on broadcasters and broadcasting stations. We also have a chapter from Tamin Dendeni, one of Radio Freedom's former program managers. And in the community radio book, we foreground the reflections of Lunkom Timde, a former UWC student, which is where Bush Radio was sort of birthed, into somebody who eventually came to shape the sector in different ways, including within the MDDA. We provide a timeline of events to ensure that there is context, and we are proud to foreground indigenous language radio as the most widely consumed. One of the shortcomings sometimes in scholarship is to look within English and Afrikaans media. And we say in the African context, to really understand the power of a medium, we really need to look at the language spoken by the people. So a lot of chapters look at what's happening with indigenous language radio stations, commercial, public service, as well as community. And then last slide. So where to next? Some questions that I think we can reflect on as we celebrate this century of radio is how our history of amateur broadcasters mirrors our present of amateur podcasters, and what are the lessons there? Secondly, the advent of digital radio and AI is a threat because you can now clone people's voices, but it's also an opportunity because although it has got the potential to disrupt radio, we have seen the endurance of radio through various ages. How do we now harness that in our planning as community radio stations, in our forecasting as radio scholars? How do we incorporate digital technology and AI from the onset? And then lastly, how do we ensure indigenous languages are not an afterthought? We sometimes see with awards, for example, the dominance of English radio as esteemed, and it's worth looking at the numbers and how that may be skewed to our reality to see how we can honor indigenous languages on radio in greater ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure it certainly got us thinking about what radio was, what it is presently, and what it could potentially become. And I'm sure there's lots of questions. So what we'll do now is open the floor for any questions and comments that you have. You can also feel free to leave any comments and questions that you have in the chat box. Thank you. Hi, Franklin, I see you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. Now, I was also maybe just thinking about the role of civil society and the whole angle of development, specifically when it comes to community radio. So as we look back, you know, the kind of role Cassette played in the setting up of a dialogue around community radio in South Africa, and that first freedom of the airwaves conferences that we had discussing, you know, how that should come about, and, you know, specifically looking at the 3-tier system, and how important that was in locating community radio within the development ecosystem within communities. I think that's also critical to note. Thank you. Franklin Aziz here.
Thank you, Franklin. Do we have any other comments, or Prof and Zoli, do you want to speak to Franklin's comment maybe?
If there isn't a response or comment, I want to maybe also add, I'll share through the platform of NC also a report we did when I was CEO at NCRF. So we had civil society, government, you know, all types of media in a round table where we were looking at the importance of social impact of specifically community radio. So that, I think it's an interesting report because you have, you know, GCIS, DOC, and all the players, stakeholders, key stakeholders at the time discussing those kind of imperatives.
Thank you, Franklin. Yeah, that would be much appreciated. Please share that with us. And then I see Reggie in the chat box says, we need to converse more about the financial sustainability of radio. What's in store in the years to come? Zoli, I think you might have something to say about that one.
Thanks, Ufenze. Yes, I think, and that is the issue that I try to address, to say we are in a market economy, And we need to try and elevate radio so that it becomes sustainable. Right now, my view is that there are very few players who are sustainable within radio. And if we as a team, as a group of radio, sell radio, I remember, I mean, years ago when I'm just forgetting his name, at the SABC, because it was a monopoly then, he used to sell radio as a whole. He used to sell, it was Kunhos. He used to sell radio as a whole. And I think that is what we as radio need to do. We need to fight for a bigger slice within the advertising market. Then how we divide it amongst ourselves, that's the second question. But the first question is that we need to ensure that radio gets a bigger slice.
Thank you, Zoli. Prof, I see you have your hand up. Yeah, is there something you want to add?
Yes, thank you. I had wanted to speak to Franklin's comment, and I think it ties in very well with the issue of the sustainability and the financial aspect. And I think the first thing about radio and activism is essential, because radio is more than medium. It's more than a media that we just consume. We do things with radio that are very impactful. And when we see community radio under threat because of a lack of investment in that sector and other issues that we are all aware of, it should worry us not just as practitioners and researchers, but as society. So I think the clarion call needs to be made for business, for government, for whoever has money in their pockets to see in radio as a critical investment in our democracy. Secondly, I think with the issue of sustainability, for me, and I am not a scholar on the political economy aspects of radio, but the numbers don't add up. The numbers of listeners versus where the investment goes, the impact versus where the draw cards are, there's a mismatch there. And I think we need to have a conversation about why it is that Indigenous language radio really struggles to attract funding beyond the practitioners, to ask business, what is it? Yes, we've got this notion of the LSM, which supposedly determines how much people can spend, but it seems that there may be structural issues there that date back to things like the Black Press, where there was a deliberate defunding of certain platforms to ensure they were not sustainable. I'm not saying that's the case with radio, but to have a conversation to understand why it is a station that has how many, 7 million listeners, gets less in advertising than a station with less than a million listeners, for example. What is the mismatch there? Because if it's about viability and consumers, it should be the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And I see in the chat box, Temba has a question similar to the one that was raised earlier, but focused more on community radio. He's asking if there's a strategy to protect and sustain community radio. And Franklin, I see you had your hand up. I don't know if you want to speak to Temba's question or add something else.
Just in terms of Temba's question, there's been forever this discussion about the ring fencing, quotas in terms of spending from a government point of view. So that debate is currently very much current. The 30% kind of rule for community media to get a kind of a 30% ring fenced percentage of spend from all government communication and media spend. So that Temba is in the pipeline, but it's been in the pipeline for the past 5 years now. It's I think at this stage there's I'm not sure. I thought I heard kind of a white paper where the issue is being raised, but that is something that's happening at the moment in terms of the discussion around a ring fence 30%. But I think back to the question, not the question, but the comments made by Sisanda, there's also the whole matter of looking at the currency that we are dealing with. So one, we can look at sustainability from a monetary point of view and say we need to get more money of the pie, and that's great. We should. But I think from the practitioner's point of view, community radio specifically should look at the kind of social impact it asserts, and then that becomes your currency. Because if you can identify, for instance, I always maintain that if you are Bush Radio, you would look at the IDP for your area and look at that integrated development plan and identify what those shortcomings are, link those development issues to your content planning, and start finding local partners that can address those social issues. And then also, when you do AGMs, you make sure that those AGMs address year-on-year performance in dealing with those social issues. So I think that's the exciting part of the future of radio. It's where we use and collaborate all of these new media and new technologies to be able to prove the social impact, to also be able to mine kind of big data from our audience so that we can use that in our Zoli in our marketing strategies. So I think we are not at the hopeless place, but in terms of sustainability, it's a global problem with community radio specifically, and also with radio in a whole. You can see that the markets are drifting towards electronic more in terms of social media, Facebook, and all of those other platforms. You will see the pie getting bigger on that side, and our pie getting smaller. So we need to find very creative ways to be able to package ourselves. And I maintain, just to close, is to say the social impact of our stations, if we look at ourselves and see ourselves as a key player in a local development ecosystem, that's maybe where we can locate ourselves as a very critical player. And then you can link cost to that in terms of organizations that got budgets to address social issues, and maybe 10% or 15% of those budgets can go towards communication expenses.
Thank you so much, Franklin. There's about 6 minutes left, so there's still time for 1 or 2 more questions. But for now, I'm going to move on to Zoli. I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Offense. I just wanted to piggyback on what Franklin said, and I agree with what you're saying. But this is where I feel that radio needs to drive a marketing project just for radio, and also engage the advertising agencies, because they operate, like you said, Franklin, that we live in a global environment, but they operate and give budgets to radio based on the first world numbers or first world data. But South Africa is very different. And I think those are the things that need to be communicated, to say this is a powerful medium in the South African context. And the way to approach it is this and that and that and that. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoli. Another point of reflection, this is from Kanya. The exorbitant transmission costs for AM or medium wave radio stations are a serious threat to their sustainability. Thank you for that comment, Kanya. Any other question or comment before we close off soon?
Maybe I think on that one, Lynn Mansfield can actually assist us there. He's a fundi when it comes to signal distribution.
Yeah. Len, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hi, Len.
Hi. If you can just repeat the question.
So Kanya was just saying that the exorbitant transmission costs for AM radio stations are a serious threat to their sustainability.
Yes, I think being an older technology, they consume a lot of power. So the transmitters are pretty high power to reach those audiences, and in that respect, FM is a lot more affordable. And then new technologies like DRM and DAB, the indications are that the signal distribution costs are 1/10 of the cost of FM. So I think as the technologies evolve, they become more spectrum efficient, they become more less power hungry, and still reach your audiences with better quality. I hope that answers it.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for responding to that, and sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah, so there's
No
still
problem.
time for one more question before we close off.
Offense, it's Nadia here.
Hi, Nadia.
Lovely to see people have put in some comments in the chat box. You know, we run these sessions fairly regularly now, and we find that we don't get the kind of engagement we always hope for. So no pressure, but it's great to see the contributions in the chat box. As we close the session, Offensive, to thank you for putting it together, but really huge gratitude to Sisanda and Zoli who made it today, and for their fantastic presentations, which we will have available to members. Sisanda, also, I think you extended this to some of your students. We hope a few of them were able to attend. If they have, that's fantastic. It's always so wonderful to get practitioners and scholars in one room, to your point. It's also great to look at the historic timeline because we have so many colleagues joining us in the industry and so many moving out of the industry. And I think it's all our responsibility to make sure that we play our part in terms of the narrative and the history and how far we've come in the sector. Today is a day of celebration. It's a celebration of radio. I think all the key concerns and challenges that have been raised by members, by the industry, challenges that we've been grappling with for a very long time. We really are hopeful that there'll be a reinvestment, certainly on the part of government and other key stakeholders, into all media, particularly into radio, it being still the most accessible, affordable, free medium on the continent and globally. So we can only but remain positive and hopeful. And we want to keep these conversations going. We want to keep their interaction, and we want to keep members thinking through some of these complex issues, but really contributing and participating, as I said, to the continued history of this industry and the sector. We all talk for plurality and diversity, and we really recognize a role in our industry played by our sector regulator, because this is a regulated sector. And we recognize a role played by the government department in their constant attempts to review the policy machinery. And regrettably, we see so much stagnancy happening there. And all we can do is be hopeful, and all we can do is put all our energies behind this to keep this industry as relevant and as powerful as it is. So really just to thank every single one of you for making it here today. Have a wonderful radio day. Continue to spread the message and the word. Continue to celebrate how far we've come. Let's never forget, in fact, how far we've come. And I think we have a wonderful journey ahead of us, because even UNESCO and other global agencies have said radio continues to adapt. It is in our lives. It is a key companion. It's a key educator, etc., etc., etc. To celebrate each and every one of you for your fantastic work, because you are leading this industry and running this industry. So it's a huge thank you and congrats to all of you. Thanks. And again, we will have the presentations available. Reach out to Fense, and please just keep looking out for other activities that we'll be running as the NAB. Keep tweeting, keep the communication and dialogue going. and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Happy World Radio Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye.